Hey guys, well, it's been a while for my Let's Build with JavaScript series. This one's going to be focusing on front-end validation. So we'll actually have some work to do on the front end that's going to validate what we actually input. So kind of saves yourself some trouble once you hit data with the back end. So if you have front end and back end validation, chances are you'll get the data you want from the public view. So what we're going to build is basically an account creation form, and all it does is as you type or submit this button, it will click and validate the data you're entering. So in this case, I'll put web crunch, and we get this nice little green arrow to signify that that's valid. If I don't put an actual valid email in this case, which we'll use some regular expression engines and stuff behind the scenes to kind of validate that, we get the same concept. So until you type the correct thing, will it pop up and validate. So with password in particular, we really want to just validate. Of course, you entered a password. We could do a length, but I don't think I did a length. We should probably maybe extend that at some point. But the main thing is that the confirmation matches your original password. If it doesn't, of course, you can't see what I'm typing. But if it did, then you'll see the green, and then everything's valid from then on. All that said, if you remove data from these fields, then you get, of course, these error states, and everything kind of propagates as we want. So this doesn't connect to any backend or anything like that. It's on a CodePen, of course, so that would make no sense. But I just want to show this in case you ever needed to add this bit of flair to your app or any type of front-end form. Maybe it's an email newsletter sign up or something. You could actually validate those pretty easily if you integrate with something like MailChimp or something. So that's what we're going to build here. It's going to be pretty scrappy just for the sake of saving some time. So I might copy and paste some code in terms of the style sheets and whatnot. But of focus here, of course, as always, is JavaScript in this case. So let's get first the markup, and I'll kind of walk you through that. And of course, I'll share this pen in the description if you haven't seen it yet. So let me get the style sheets copied over, and CodePen should do its thing. So then we have this basic form. I'm not using any framework or anything. I styled this custom just because I didn't want you to have to integrate anything custom to know how to do this or need to learn a framework. But in each input group, we have a label, an input, and then some state error state span tags. So each span tag is going to actually represent where the error displays for that given input. We'll actually identify which input we're going to target based on its ID and so forth. So if there is a valid input, we display a certain icon success, and then if it's invalid, we display an icon error hidden. And those are styled in such a way that they display actually in the absolute positioned portion to the right of the video of the input. And then that just repeats itself for email specifically too. So the difference here is we're using a type of email for this input. And then of course the same for password below. So the biggest difference is each input has a different label name and ID name. And we'll reference those in our JavaScript as well as these other errors classes, of course, the button as well. So let's dig in. So what I like to do typically on my JavaScript side of the equation is kind of start with the ES6 class. So a specific class, thinking in terms of reusability. So at some point you might need to reuse this for other forms or something in that nature. And in that way you can pass in within an instance of a new class the specific form you're dealing with and the fields associated with it. So this kind of has mostly reusable things, but a lot of times you're going to need some stuff custom, especially for the password stuff. Not every field or form is going to have password. So what I like to do is start with a class called Form Validator. I'm just calling that because it's basically generic. I wanted it to be a way to hook into other forms as we kind of go in and do our work. So let's go, and first with a class, an ES6 class, you need a constructor function, and within that we're going to accept a form and the fields. So the specific fields we're dealing with, I'll loop through each and kind of do things with those. And then the form itself we're actually paying attention to. So I'm going to say this dot form equals form, and then this dot fields equals fields. And this is just a way to initialize these methods so we have access to them in our class. So at any point in another method, I could say this dot form and it will associate it to this form validator class. If you're not 100% on ES6, this is just syntactic sugar over kind of a prototype pattern that's in JavaScript. And it's more of an object-oriented approach. This just kind of cleans it up, makes it look pretty, and maybe kind of familiar to maybe other languages. Maybe it's Ruby or like other class-based languages that you need to initialize things on. Since I come from a Ruby background, I identify with an initialize function. So typically when I do a class, I'll do initialize, if I can spell initialize, and then define a new function. So we'll do some work here initially, but we can say console.log this.form for now, and then the same for fields, just to give us some context. So a class needs to be initialized. So the way to do that typically is to use this new keyword on the class itself. But we need a way to access our form and our fields from the DOM, and typically that's just a query-based thing. So what I'll do is, from the outside of the class, I'll do a const form equals document query selector, and then we have a form class on the form HTML. If you recall, real quick, I went through that fast, and I apologize. But there is a class there that we're going to actually target the form itself. And then below that, we'll do the same for the fields. So in this case, we're going to say, we're going to pass in what's going to be each ID for each field here. So I'm going to target these specifically, but I'm going to try to make it almost in a meta programming fashion where we target the names automatically based on their IDs and then query select them all at once. So we have access to each. So instead of passing like query selector all to whatever thing, I'm just going to pass their actual identifiers. So username in particular is the first one. Email is the second. Password third, and then password confirmation is the fourth. So that sets up our actual fields. That's just an array at this point. It's not doing anything, but it's some state that we have to work with as we mount this thing. So what I like to do is just basically set a variable to this if I ever need access to it. You don't necessarily need to do this, but you might. But what typically happens is you need the new keyword, and then you say form validator. And within that, you can pass the form and then the fields. And what I like to do is, since I hook into that initialize method, I'll just say validator dot initialize. It's kind of hard to spell. And so we call that, and we'll probably get an error or something if I don't have this set up, but it looks like it's coming back with our console. So if I save this once more, we should hopefully get something returned. Yeah, there we go. So we get the whole form in the console. CodePen's console is a little tricky, but I might move myself there. But below we have the fields specifically are this. So we're console logging that, and then this dot form. So that is initializing that class is valid, so there's no errors so far. I promise you I'll have errors though. It's knowing me. So I'm going to close the console for now and kind of revert back to the next step. So since we have these things to work with in our class now, we can think about how we're going to actually hook into setting a status of if it's an error or a valid field, and then or doing the same thing as we're typing and on submit. So like I want to kind of scope those things out. So the first thing I'll do is validate on submit. So I'm going to create a new method called validate on submit. And what we'll do is call it from this method. So validate on submit. This is just a way, kind of a catch-all method here. So when we initialize, call that one function, it calls the rest that we need to go ahead and do to perform the operations we're after. So what we'll do on submit is actually listen for the click event on this button. And that's going to look like this. We're going to say this.form, since we have access to it now in our class, .add event listener. And I'll say submit, and we can pass the event through. I'll use a fat arrow. You could use a traditional callback function in this look and feel, but this is more of the ES6 pattern. So then we'll actually kind of prevent default on that event. So e.prevent default, because we don't want it to actually submit without us validating first, because it will by default based on the input type. So we actually have a input type at the bottom, I believe, of submit. So its default nature in HTML is to submit unless you bypass it with this callback. So inside this event listener, we don't actually have access to this. This becomes relative to the actual callback function. So you could do a couple things here. Traditionally, you might have seen someone say let self equals this. So you always have access to this at the highest level of higher order, but you might also want to bind this to the actual event listener. So you can actually call bind.this on the brackets here to kind of get this same scope. That's confusing. It took me a while to understand, and it's still kind of fuzzy, but that allows you to kind of get this inside of this area. So we'll see for sure if that's the case. So I'm going to actually access this.fields now, which we get from our constructor. And then for each of those, we're going to say field, and we'll do some looping through here. For each of them, we're going to say a query. So we'll just say input equals document query selector. And we'll use the template literals in ES6 to kind of dynamically target this thing. So what I'll first do is pass in the field, since we have access to that instance here, but we also need the ID, since each is actually an ID in the HTML. So each field is going to be queried by, I'll give you an example. So for password, we'll actually query by password, and those map to what we passed below, if you recall. Now you could have easily maybe skipped a step here and added those ID hashes there if you want. It's up to you. I think that's easier to forget though, so you might think about who else is going to read this code later and how they're going to adapt to using it. There might need to be a little documentation about it, but this is a way to kind of identify that pattern. So in this method, for each of the fields, we're going to validate on submit. So we're going to loop through each and do this validation that we're going to hook up. That's going to be a whole nother method, but for now I'm going to call this dot validate. And in fact, I'm going to actually go the old school route. I know this one works. Uncomment this, and I'm going to say, just for safety's sake, self, and the same here, self. We always have access to this in this case. So we'll say validate fields is a new method I need to create, and then pass in the input. And we'll get to that method in a minute. So let's do that now, actually. We'll save that down. Get any errors? Doesn't look like it. Okay, so if I submit this, we can just kind of maybe do a console.log input just to see if they return. If I click on that, so that didn't work. So validate on submit. Why are we getting that? Console.log, self.fields for each console.log input. I think this might have thrown it off. So we don't have that field yet. That's still doing it. Form add event. Oh, I can't spell. Lists inner. Well, for now, I'm going to assume this is okay. We'll come back to it because I feel like there's a bug there I don't see, but we'll figure it out. So validate on submit, it was that one. We will also want to do while we're typing. So there's another one that's basically going to do a similar pattern. So we'll say validate on entry. We're going to follow the same protocol for the most part, only we're going to listen for different events, of course. So, and then instead of the form, we're going to say this.fields for each we'll do our query selector, and it will be for the field again, and then we'll do the for each input instead. We'll actually listen for the input itself. So add event listener input, and then we can do an event callback, and then we'll do the same method below. I wish this was auto format. Spoiled by my code editor. All right. And then finally, these two are basically calling the same method, but in a different event pattern. So in a way, this isn't the most reusable code. You could make it drier, I bet, but we're going to leave it as is. So we'll say validate on entry. So those two will call the main method. We don't have that one yet, so I'll say validate fields. It's going to take in a field. So the first thing we want to do, for each field, we're going to check the presence of their existence, like if they exist. So we don't want to accept anything that's blank. And we can do that first by saying if field dot value dot trim, we're going to trim it as it comes in, is equal to nothing. We'll do some statuses, else another status. So let's get into these status methods so it makes more sense as we go down. We'll say this dot set status, and that's going to be a new method I'm going to call. It's going to pass in the field, and then like whatever message you want to display. So we'll say, in this case, field previous element sibling. I'll show you how I got that in a second. And then we need to give it some signifier of what kind of status it is. So I made this as reusable as I could. So before I go too far down that path, let's do this set status method so you can make sense of what that's actually doing. So set status. This will query the field, we'll pass in a message, and the status itself just by an identifier we pass. So it's going to be error or success, I believe. So I'll first get the success icons. Is going to take from the field, we're going to go to the parent element dot query selector icon success, and we'll do the same for error. we need to go, so the reason I'm going to the parent element is we need to traverse up from the field itself. Since we're querying the field by their actual IDs, that's just targeting the input. What we need to do is go up to one parent of that and then go back down into the closest icon class that's there. So that's a way to go to the field, go up a bit, come back down in and find that icon specifically instead of like all of the icons or trying to figure out or giving the icons their own unique identifier, which would be very kind of a pain in the ass. So I'm going to go this route. Error icon. Make this a little wider. Okay, and then we can do error message next. So error message is the same field.parent query selector. We'll say error message. So if you recall, each input has the grouping of these things. So there's an error message per input, an icon success per input, and an icon error per input. Those two things are hidden by default with a hidden class I have in the CSS right here. And then I styled, of course, the icons proportionally. If you want to refer to this pen, I recommend doing that for the styles. I don't want to go too far down that path in this video. So first, since we have these now, we can go and say if status, which is what we're passing through, equals success. So it needs to be either success or message. And we could do more checking here. If you pass something other, we could throw back an error saying, hey, that's the wrong thing. I'm keeping this pretty plain and Jane. So up to you if you want to extend it. We'll have two statuses for these. So in success, we'll say if error icon exists, we'll do just, I'm just doing this quickly inline. So error icon dot class list dot add hidden, just in case it's there. And then if error message, we'll do the same. So error message, but in this case, we'll say inner text is nothing. It's basically set the interior text to an empty string. Then if it's successful, we're going to say success icon dot class list dot remove hidden. And then finally field dot class list dot remove input error. So I have a class in the CSS that's input error. And that's essentially just adds a red border around it if there is an error. So this resets it if there is a success state. We'll show the success icon otherwise. So in this case, we can kind of copy these over. And they're kind of different actually. So if it's error, we'll do if success icon dot class list add hidden. We don't want the success icon if there's an error. And field dot parent element. Again, we're traversing up the DOM and then going back into it so we can query for the error message here. And we could probably just do error message here. So error message dot inner text equals message, which is what we're passing in here. That's only if there's an error. So if there's success state, we won't need a message to really display unless you're just trying to annoy people. But error icon dot class list dot remove hidden, and then field dot class list add input error. So each of these kind of compete with each other in a way. Like if there's something set from the one, it's going to be unset from the other. So you kind of have to do this toggle switch effect between each. But since there's only two, it's not a huge deal. But if you were to add more states to this mix, it could get kind of tricky. You'd probably need something a little more dynamic than this. So in this case, if the fields are empty, we would get the same call to this error state. So let's double check my console and see if we get any errors right now. If I were to just type, is there anything going on? Nothing yet. So let's double check validate on entry. We can confirm this works if I get to the field, and I'm going to just kind of console the event. And I'll open my traditional console log. We're not getting anything here. Okay. Typos, guys. That's like the story of my life, I swear. Sorry about all of that. Okay, I'm going to clear the console. We've got our fields. Let's validate on entry. We could validate on submit that this is doing something. Okay, cool. So that's working. Our stuff is actually setting since we have our set state fields now, or set status, excuse me. So on submit's technically working in this case. And if we were to type in, see, we don't have that yet. So we need to do the success side of this. So on the empty state, which is where we're at now in the actual validations phase, we can say this.set status. And we'll set field, and we need to set null for the second parameter because we won't have a message for success messages, but we can have still use this function as a result. So if I were to do that again, I think if I enter Andy, we get most of that's working in this case. So I think we need to double check some of the field class input error. Yeah, I need to just remove that period. Had a typo again. So in this case, if I do Andy, there we go. So we're pretty close already. Now we don't have our password confirmation. We just have the blank state. So if there's basically no fields with no values, we've got that covered. But now I need to figure out first, let's do the email. Email, I'm going to use a regular expression kind of pattern to kind of work with this, and you can use it using the .test method. I think that's newer to ES6. I could be wrong though. But if we say if field type, and type, if you hook into the DOM, we can do this real quick. I'll just show you. Console.log field.type, and I'll just do this real quick in the browser. I wish I could just not see the warnings. Okay, we're back. So I want to add this console.log to this state here. So I already know there's going to be errors, but I want to just show you the field.type property. It actually returns what kind of field type you have. And in our case, we want the email specifically. And we'll do the same with the password in a second. So we'll say basically if field type is equal to email, we will do some magic. So I'm going to make a regular expression here, and it's kind of a wonky one. But we're going to basically look for the basic constructs of a typical email. I'm not a pro with regular expressions, so I'm not great at explaining what this actually is, but I'm assuming it's looking for the @ symbol and the dot extension of an email address to actually be validated. And you could go way deeper than this, but this is what I found to be the most succinct but useful. And just do a bit of Googling or steal this and it'll work just great. So we're going to take that variable and we're going to actually just use the test method, and we could pass in the field.value to ensure that it is approaching that. So if it's actually validated, we'll set the status to success. Set the status to success. Status. Again, we'll pass in the field and the null value and then the success string just to give it the identifier, and then else if it's not, we'll say this dot set status field again. We'll pass in an error message. Man, I cannot type. Please enter and then I'll pass error in below. So in this case, if we start typing, it's not valid, not valid, not valid, getting there, pretty valid. So not perfect, but let's see what's another, yeah. So it's basic. It could be better, but we'll leave it at that. That's just a general idea of what you could do there. And then moving on to the password, we'll just say if field.type equals password. Actually, we'll want to do this for password confirmation specifically, so we can kind of just hook into the ID and just match our string. This isn't very reusable, but you're probably only going to approach password confirmations maybe once or twice in an app, so I'm not sure what you want to do here. If you want this to be more approachable, this might be better extracted out into some other class or something. I'm not sure. But what I'm going to actually do is just look for this password field specifically and just do the query for it. And then we'll say if field.value.trim is equal to an empty string, we'll perform this dot set status field password confirmation required. So we're basically going to say if the password confirmation doesn't exist, we don't want to allow you to proceed. So we'll tell it's an error in this case. We'll do another else if in this case. That's why this one's kind of different. And then we'll say field.value is not equal to password field.value. So we want those to match in this case. And for that, we'll do the same with the error state. We can just copy this and say password does not match. And then finally, if we'll say else, we'll say this dot set status field is null and then success. So if it all looks good, we'll allow it to go through. So we can try that real quick and just say password. Of course, that's valid, but if we don't have the same one here, it's not going to match until you say password. So that's actually working. Here we go. So cool, guys. That's the gist of it. This is the approach I would take. I know it's not 100% dry and repeatable, but a lot of these fields aren't in the grand scheme of things. So you could use this form validator and maybe have a form password confirmation validator class and then kind of import that in or extend it from this if you wanted to get super fancy. I think overall, though, the general consensus is you need some event listeners listening for both your key entry and submit on these forms. Once they are actually included and, you know, valid, we get our green states, which is great. So what you could do additionally is maybe disable this button until things are valid. That's maybe something I invite you to try. You could listen for the fields. If there are any errors at all, you can just say, you know, disable that button or just disable it by default until the things are valid. I tend to go that path if I were to go encode that. So I hope this was useful. I'm not a JavaScript whiz per se, but I've used it in the past to kind of give an essence of, you know, using more of the modern stuff, maybe the ES6 classes and stuff to our advantage here, so we can just mount a new form at any point and pass in alternative fields. And we're already checking if these fields are these things, so if they don't exist, it really wouldn't backfire, but there's just extra code under the hood you have to consider. So that's it for now. Hoping to do more JavaScript stuff in the future as time progresses, of course. I wanted to put this in the pipe as I've done mostly Ruby on Rails stuff, as you can, if you've been following along. That's mostly what the channel's about, but I'm kind of expanding out into different avenues, and I hope you enjoy it. So let me know in the comments if you like this or you want to see something else. Let me know as well. All right, guys. So long for now.